There's one king everyone trots out as the ultimate cautionary tale of royal inbreeding, a man so genetically scrambled that his own autopsy report belongs in a horror novel. His name was Charles II of Spain, and the genuinely wild part is that history's most famous queen, Cleopatra, may have been even more inbred than he was. Let's actually check the math on that, because it goes to some deeply strange places. What inbreeding actually does. First, you need one number, and it's the only bit of science in this whole video, so stick with me. It's called the inbreeding coefficient, written as F, and it measures the probability that the two copies of any given gene in your body are identical because they came from the same ancestor twice. You get one copy of each gene from your mom and one from your dad. Normally, those copies come from totally different family lines, so if one copy has a defect, the other one covers for it. Inbreeding is when your parents are close relatives, so both copies trace back to the same recent ancestor, and that backup copy vanishes. Suddenly, every hidden genetic flaw your family was quietly carrying gets a chance to show up. Think of your genome as two decks of cards, one from each parent. Usually the decks come from different factories, so a printing error in one is covered by the good card in the other. Inbreeding means both decks rolled off the exact same press. Same flaw, both decks, no backup. That's the whole problem in one sentence. Here are the numbers you need. A child of a brother and sister, or of a parent and their own child, has an F of 0.25. A child of an uncle and niece comes in at 0.125. First cousins produce a child at 0.0625. The higher that number climbs, the more of your genome is running on duplicate copies, and the more likely something goes horribly wrong. Hold on to 0.25. It's about to matter a lot. Now, everybody carries a handful of broken genes. You do, I do, everyone does. We just get away with it because we each have a healthy backup copy quietly doing the job. The danger of inbreeding isn't that it creates new defects out of nowhere, it's that it takes the flaws already hiding in a family and doubles them up until they can't hide anymore. So the more a family folds back in on itself, the more it stops rolling the dice and starts loading them. A single cousin marriage is usually harmless. The problem is what happens when a family does it over and over, for generations, until the whole tree stops branching and just becomes a very tall, very narrow ladder. The bewitched king. Now meet the champion. Charles II of Spain, born in 1661, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, and nicknamed El Hechizado, which means the bewitched, because people genuinely thought only sorcery could explain a man that broken. In 2009, a team of Spanish geneticists led by Gonzalo Alvarez did something incredible. They reconstructed the family tree of the Spanish Habsburg kings, tracing roughly 3,000 relatives across 16 generations, and calculated the actual inbreeding coefficient for each one. Charles II came out at F equals 0.254. Read that again. Remember how a brother and sister produce a child at 0.25? Charles II scored higher than that. His parents weren't even siblings. They were only an uncle and niece. So how did he beat sibling-level incest? Because his family had been marrying their own relatives for about 200 years straight. His parents' link was just the final layer on a cake of cousin marriages going back generations, and all those separate loops of inbreeding stacked on top of each other. The dynasty's founder scored a tidy 0.025. 2 centuries later, Charles hit 0.254, a tenfold increase. 9 out of 11 Habsburg royal marriages in the study were between blood relatives. They didn't dip a toe in the gene pool. They cannonballed into the shallow end repeatedly. The Habsburgs did this on purpose, and they thought they had excellent reasons. They saw themselves as the great Catholic defenders of Europe, too important and too pure to marry down into lesser families, and definitely too proud to marry a Protestant. So they mostly married each other. His own father, Philip IV, had already scored a high number for the era. His great-grandfather, Philip II, the king who launched the Spanish Armada, married 4 times, and one of those wives was his own niece, Anna of Austria, who happened to be the ancestor of Charles down the line. When you draw the Habsburg family tree, the lines that should fan outward keep curling back and reconnecting into a tangled knot, and you can literally see the damage in their portraits. Look at 200 years of Habsburg paintings in a row, and one feature marches straight down the generations: the Habsburg jaw. It's a lower jaw and chin that jut way out past the upper teeth, paired with a heavy drooping lower lip. Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe in his day, had it so badly he reportedly couldn't close his mouth all the way and struggled to chew or speak clearly. Painters like Velázquez and Titian recorded the feature honestly, jutting chin after jutting chin. A modern study in 2019 actually analyzed the faces in these royal portraits and found that the worse the jaw deformity, the more inbred the individual, with inbreeding explaining a big chunk of the variation. The family's own art became an accidental medical chart. And in Charles II, that centuries-long experiment reached its grim finale: a body that failed. The result was a human being who barely functioned. Charles inherited that same Habsburg jaw in its most extreme form, jutting so far past the upper that he couldn't chew his food and had to swallow it in chunks, which wrecked his digestion for life. His tongue was too big for his mouth, so he drooled and could barely be understood when he spoke. He didn't talk until he was around 4. He couldn't walk until he was about 8. He was sickly, weak, and short his entire life, prone to constant illness, and both of his marriages produced 0 children, because he was almost certainly infertile. Geneticists now think he was carrying 2 separate recessive disorders at once, a hormonal deficiency and a kidney condition, a genetic double whammy that only becomes likely when your family tree is a straight line, instead of a branching one. The broader Habsburg numbers are just as bleak. Among the royal children born into the dynasty over that period, only about half survived to the age of 10, compared to roughly 80% of children in the ordinary Spanish villages nearby. Let that land for a second. Peasant babies with no doctors, no palace, and no fortune were outliving the royal heirs, because the peasants had one thing the kings had thrown away: a normal, branching family tree. Charles II was the end point of all of it. A man who spent his 38 years mostly sick, weak, and childless. A king who could rule a global empire on paper but couldn't reliably feed himself at dinner. When he died in 1700, his doctors performed an autopsy, partly because they were still half convinced he'd been cursed. The report is legendary. It claimed his body did not contain a single drop of blood, that his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines rotten, he had a single blackened testicle, and his head was full of water. Now, a peppercorn-sized heart is physically impossible, so that report is clearly exaggerated by shocked doctors staring at a very sick corpse. But it tells you exactly how the man was seen: a body so wrong that reality and rumor blurred together. And because he died childless, the entire Spanish Habsburg line went extinct with him, which kicked off a continent-swallowing conflict called the War of the Spanish Succession. One infertile king caused a world war just by dying. So that's the guy Cleopatra is being compared to. The reigning, undisputed, scientifically measured champion of royal inbreeding. Good luck, Cleopatra. 11 generations of this. Here's why the comparison isn't crazy. The Habsburgs mostly married cousins and the occasional niece. The Ptolemies, Cleopatra's family, went much harder. For them, marrying your actual full-blooded sibling wasn't a scandal, it was the house style. The dynasty was founded by Ptolemy I, a Macedonian Greek general who grabbed Egypt after Alexander the Great died. His descendants ruled for nearly 300 years, and along the way they turned sibling marriage into official policy for 3 big reasons. 1. It made them look divine and properly Egyptian, since Egyptian myth had the god Osiris marry his sister Isis. 2. It kept all the money and power locked inside the family with no in-laws and no rival heirs. And 3. It kept their Greek bloodline pure, which is a deeply ironic goal for people pretending to be Egyptian pharaohs. The trendsetter was Ptolemy II, who married his own full sister Arsinoe. They were so proud of it that they both took the official nickname Philadelphoi, which literally translates to sibling lovers. They branded themselves after their own incest, stamped it on coins, and dared anyone to object. That first sibling marriage happened to be childless, but the taboo was now broken, and the next generations made up for it. Ptolemy IV married his full sister Arsinoe III, and this time they had a son, so now the incest was baked directly into the bloodline that produces future kings. Every so often the family was forced to marry an outsider, simply because there wasn't a sibling of the right age handy. Ptolemy V had to import a foreign bride, a Seleucid princess named Cleopatra I, which is actually where the name Cleopatra enters the family in the first place. But that fresh blood never lasted, because her children promptly went right back to marrying each other. Then came Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Potbelly, who really committed to the theme. He married his sister Cleopatra II, and then, not content with that, also married her daughter Cleopatra III, who was simultaneously his own niece and his stepdaughter. He was married to a woman and her daughter at the same time, both of them his blood relatives. Sit with how tangled that is. Their kids were each other's cousins, half-siblings, and step-siblings all at once. This is Cleopatra's direct family tree. 11 generations of people treating the family reunion as a dating pool, and treating the words aunt, sister, and wife as basically interchangeable. A son in a box. And in case you're picturing these as gentle, dreamy royals in love, let me correct that immediately, because the Ptolemies were monsters. That same Ptolemy VIII, nicknamed Potbelly, got into a feud with his sister, wife Cleopatra II, around 130 BC, so he took their own son, a boy of about 12, had him killed and chopped into pieces, and mailed the body parts to his mother as a birthday present. That's not a metaphor. He gift-wrapped their dismembered child for her birthday. He wasn't even the worst of them. An earlier Ptolemy, the 11th, married his own cousin and stepmother Berenice, a popular and respected ruler, and then had her murdered after being married to her for about 19 days. The people of Alexandria were so disgusted that they dragged him out and lynched him. When your own citizens execute you for going too far, in a family this brutal, you have achieved something remarkable. Cleopatra herself was not exactly a peacemaker either. When her younger sister Arsinoe IV became a rival threat, Cleopatra had her murdered on the steps of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus in 41 BC, which horrified even the Romans, since killing someone inside a sacred temple was a massive taboo. She's also widely believed to have arranged the poisoning of her own brother-husband Ptolemy XIV, clearing the path for her son to inherit. Another of her sisters, Berenice IV, had earlier seized the throne while their father was away and was executed by him the moment he returned. In this family, marrying your sibling and murdering your sibling were both just normal items on the weekly schedule, often involving the very same sibling. They were essentially ancient reality TV villains with unlimited money, a private army, and absolutely no editors telling them to tone it down. The mother we can't name. Okay, so the Ptolemies were incest professionals, but to actually beat Charles II, we need to nail down Cleopatra's specific parents. And this is exactly where the whole thing gets slippery. Her father is not in doubt. He was Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, because he reportedly enjoyed playing the flute more than he enjoyed the tedious business of actually running a country. Her mother, though, is a genuine historical mystery, and it drives scholars up the wall. The leading guess is a woman named Cleopatra V, who was Ptolemy XII's wife, and who conveniently vanishes from all official records just a few months after Cleopatra was born, almost as if history hit a wall exactly where we most need it to keep going. Historians can't even fully agree whether Cleopatra V and a figure sometimes called Cleopatra VI were two different women or the same woman recorded twice, which tells you how thin the evidence gets. The real catch is that nobody knows exactly how Cleopatra V herself was related to Ptolemy XII. She might have been his full sister, she might have been his half-sister, she might have been a cousin, and each of those options produces a wildly different number. The most careful academic study of Ptolemaic incest, by the historian Sheila Ager, lays out just how relentless the family's inbreeding was. But even she stops short of slapping a hard coefficient on Cleopatra, precisely because that one maternal link is missing. When the leading expert says, "We can catalog the incest but we can't do the final math," you know you're standing on genuinely soft ground. If her parents were full siblings, sitting on top of 250 years of accumulated family inbreeding, Cleopatra's coefficient could rocket well past Charles II's 0.254. If her mother was merely a cousin, the number drops a lot and might not beat him at all. This is the single most important fork in the entire question, and it hangs on the identity of one woman who disappeared from history almost the moment her daughter arrived. And to make it worse, Cleopatra then married two of her own brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, keeping the tradition alive for a hypothetical next generation. The 45% problem. You'll see a specific number thrown around online for Cleopatra. People say her inbreeding coefficient was about 0.45 or 45%. That would make her almost twice as inbred as Charles II, an absolutely staggering figure. I have to be straight with you here, because this is where a lot of videos lie. That 45% number is not from a peer-reviewed scientific paper. It comes from amateur family tree reconstructions that assume the worst-case scenario, that her parents were full siblings, and then stack every prior Ptolemaic incestuous marriage on top. It's a plausible ceiling, an educated upper estimate, but it is not a measured fact the way Charles II's 0.254 is a measured fact. And that difference is the entire heart of this story, so let me say it plainly. Charles II's number rests on a complete, verified family tree, covering roughly 3,000 people across 16 generations. Historians can name every single link in the chain. It's bedrock. Cleopatra's number rests on a guess about a mother we can't even name, in a family so fond of recycling the name Cleopatra that scholars can't always tell which one they're reading about. Her tomb has never been found, and her body is almost certainly gone forever, likely lost when Rome took over Egypt after her death. So there's no skeleton to examine, no DNA to test, and no way to ever settle it definitively. One of these numbers is measured science. The other is a very educated hunch built on an empty space in the records. Anyone who tells you flatly that Cleopatra's inbreeding coefficient was 45% is quietly skipping over that gap. It might have been. It's a reasonable worst case, but honesty means admitting that the true number lives somewhere on a wide range, and we're missing the one piece of information that would pin it down. That uncertainty isn't a disappointing footnote. It is genuinely the most interesting thing about the whole question. So is the title true? Time to actually answer the question this whole thing is built on. Was Cleopatra more inbred than Charles II? The honest answer is a confident, probably, and here's the reasoning. The Habsburgs inbred by leaning on cousins with the occasional niece thrown in. The Ptolemies inbred by marrying full siblings as the default setting for 11 straight generations, and full sibling marriage compounds far faster and far harder than cousin marriage. As a bloodline, The Ptolemies were simply doing a more concentrated, more extreme version of the exact thing that broke Charles II. They out-incested the Habsburgs not by accident but as deliberate policy for centuries. So, on the level of the dynasty, it's not even close. Cleopatra came from a much more inbred lineage than Charles ever did. The Habsburgs took about 200 years to build up their damage. The Ptolemies had a running start of nearly 300 years, and a far more aggressive method. Whether Cleopatra personally, as one individual, scored a higher F than his exact 0.254 depends entirely on who her mother was, and that we cannot prove. The strongest true statement is this: her family was more inbred than his, and if her parents were siblings, then so was she, by a comfortable margin. The title isn't a lie, it's just writing on the one fact history flatly refuses to hand us. If you want the short version to win an argument at a party, here it is. Charles II is the most inbred royal we can prove. Cleopatra may well be the most inbred royal there ever was. Those two sentences are both true at the same time, and that's not a dodge. That's just where the evidence honestly runs out. The twist nobody expects. Now here's the part that should genuinely mess with your head. If Cleopatra was potentially the most inbred royal in recorded history, she should have been a wreck. Another Charles II, drooling and broken and barely able to speak. She was the exact opposite. Cleopatra was, by every account, brilliant. The Greek writer Plutarch, who was actually pretty critical of her, still admitted that her presence was irresistible and that talking with her was mesmerizing. He wrote that she could switch languages so easily that she rarely needed an interpreter, and answered most foreign visitors, Egyptians, Arabs, Hebrews, Medes, Parthians, and others, directly in their own tongue. That's often reported as her speaking as many as 9 languages. She was famously the first ruler of her entire Greek dynasty, after roughly 250 years of them lording it over Egypt, to actually bother learning Egyptian, the language of the people she ruled. Everyone before her literally couldn't be bothered to speak to their own subjects. She was educated at the legendary Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world. She was politically ruthless and effective, held Egypt independent for 2 decades while Rome swallowed everything around it, outmaneuvered the Roman superpower not once but twice, and personally allied with and charmed both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, the 2 most powerful men of the age. She had 4 children, all seemingly healthy. Her portraits on coins show a sharp, strong-featured woman with a famously prominent hooked nose, striking and formidable rather than deformed. No drooping Habsburg jaw, no inability to walk or speak, no horror story autopsy. If she really carried the highest inbreeding coefficient in royal history, her body absolutely refused to show it. So how does someone potentially that inbred turn out that capable? A few possibilities. One is just plain luck, since F is only a probability, not a guarantee. A high coefficient means you're more likely to draw a bad genetic hand, but you can absolutely carry a scary number and still, by pure chance, never flip over the specific harmful combinations that would have wrecked you. Charles II drew the nightmare hand. Cleopatra may have simply drawn better cards from the same rigged deck. The second possibility is a genuinely brutal idea called genetic purging. When a family inbreeds this intensely for this long, the worst genetic combinations keep getting exposed generation after generation, and the individuals unlucky enough to inherit them tend to die young or fail to have children. Over centuries, that acts as a savage filter. The lethal genes get repeatedly flushed out of the surviving line, because the people carrying them didn't survive to pass them on. So the Ptolemies who made it to adulthood and kept reproducing may have been the descendants of a family that had already, in the cruelest way imaginable, weeded out many of its own deadliest flaws. 2,000 years of playing genetic Russian roulette might have used up a lot of the loaded chambers. And the third possibility loops right back to our central mystery. Maybe her mother simply wasn't a close relative at all. If Cleopatra V was a cousin, or an outside bride we've lost track of, then Cleopatra's real coefficient was never sky-high to begin with. The 45% figure collapses, and there was never anything for her body to reveal. Same family, same reputation, but a very different set of dice. Whatever the reason, the result is one of history's great ironies. The same genetic gamble that shattered Charles II may have produced one of the sharpest rulers the ancient world ever saw, older than the pyramids feels. One last thing to properly break your sense of time, because it reframes this whole woman. We think of Cleopatra and ancient pyramids as belonging to the same dusty, ancient Egypt bucket. They don't. The Great Pyramid of Giza was finished around 2560 BC. Cleopatra was born in 69 BC. That's a gap of roughly 2,500 years between the pyramid and Cleopatra. Now measure forward from Cleopatra to Neil Armstrong walking on the moon in 1969. And that gap is only about 2,000 years, which means Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing, to the internet, to your smartphone, than she did to the construction of the pyramids that stood in her own backyard. When she looked at the Great Pyramid, It was already about 2,500 years old to her, as ancient and mysterious to Cleopatra as the fall of Rome is to us. She was not some figure from the deep dawn of history. She was, in the grand timeline, almost our neighbor, a woman who would probably have understood a modern political scandal better than she'd have understood how her own pyramids got built. So the final scorecard reads like this. Charles II was the measured, proven king of inbreeding, a body so broken it ended a dynasty and started a war. Cleopatra came from a family that inbred harder and longer than his ever did, quite possibly making her the more inbred of the two, and she responded by learning 9 languages and running rings around the Roman Empire. History's most notorious inbred king could barely chew his dinner. History's most notorious inbred queen nearly conquered the ancient world. Genetics, it turns out, doesn't always read the script.